Okay, I'm going to be talking about SeaWorld in response to the proposition that SeaWorld does not take good care of their animals like they put on paper. And my opponent's claims are, first, that the conditions at SeaWorld are harmful for the orca population in parks, and a second is employees hired by SeaWorld are unfit to take care of whales, and the third is orcas at SeaWorld are unhealthy and mistreat them. My proposition is that SeaWorld takes good care of their animals. In response to the first claim that the conditions at SeaWorld are harmful for orca population in parks, my first claim is that whales at SeaWorld lifespan is equivalent to those in the wild. SeaWorld reports that 5 animals are older than 30 and 1 is close to 50. He also supports this with the tiny tanks at SeaWorld are inherently cruel, and PETA is where his source is from. But at the Miami Sea Aquarium, a killer whale named Loda lives in a tank about 1/10 of the size of those at SeaWorld. Todd Wright, a reporter from NBC6 South Florida, says that Loda swims in the world's smallest killer whale tank in North America, deeming that SeaWorld doesn't have the tiny tanks. My second claim in response to his claim that employees hired by SeaWorld are unfit, I say my response is employees at SeaWorld are trained professionals. A SeaWorld trainer may be an apprentice for 4 years before doing water work segments with killer whales. Over time, apprentice trainers may become associate trainers, and then senior trainers. He also claims that trainers are just performers, and they are not animal professionals. SeaWorld says that zoos and aquariums often hire qualified people from within their own ranks. And SeaWorld also does not require a college degree to be eligible for the training position, but is preferred as from my other source that SeaWorld trainers may be apprentices, and that's what SeaWorld says. My third response claim is that orcas at SeaWorld are not mistreated, in response to his claim that our orcas at SeaWorld are unhealthy and mistreated. Most whales are rescued after beaching or suffering from injuries which the U.S. government deems unreleasable. And SeaWorld also claims that more than 80% of marine mammals in SeaWorld parks were born in human care. And SeaWorld is also under the Animal Welfare Act, Endangered Species Act, and Marine Mammal Protection Act. So they have lots of rules and stuff they have to abide by. Another point he points out is that collapsed dorsal fins are not normal or healthy, and he uses Dr. Gingrich, and she has studied orcas since 1987 and is a co-principal investigator since 1994, and she says that less than 1% of wild orcas have collapsed dorsal fins. And I also use the same information, but I include that she reports that 5 reasons for the captive dorsal fin are in the patterns of swimming, because they mainly swim in direct circles, and resting at the surface, the gravity takes over, which makes the fin also turn, and the warmer temperature waters, lower hydration, and genetics with lack of experience plays a role, she says, in why it's the dorsal collapse. Which leads me to my conclusion that SeaWorld whales have an equivalent lifespan of those that are in the wild, and trainers are trained professionals, as well as orcas at SeaWorld are not mistreated. Thank you.
All right, well, the topic is clearly labeled. The secondary issues are previewed pretty clearly also, so that makes things fine. When you get to the first point, I think your signpost was very clear. You sometimes are presenting a counterclaim, and sometimes you're presenting the advocate's claim, and you need to be a little bit more consistent about that. So just remind us, so on that first point where the advocate said this, here are the things that I'm saying, so that your arguments, your discrete counterclaims or challenges to their claims are not going to be confused with an explanation about what the advocate said again. The argument on the first point talking about the lifespan of the animals, I thought you had some pretty good evidence on this. Admittedly, it comes from SeaWorld, but the examples, I don't know how many animals they are, but saying that they've got 5 animals who are more than 30 years old and one who's close to 50 years old. We didn't get any comparable data for animals in the wild, so we don't really know if that seems like it's reasonable. I think you want to point out that the advocate failed to present us a standard by how we can measure whether or not an animal's life is long or not. The tank size argument, I think you have a good idea here. I think it needs to be a little bit more eloquently stated. The fact that there are other places where their animals are in smaller tanks, I think that that's a perfectly legitimate point to make. But what you want to do is then make the inference that says, so it's not SeaWorld that is necessarily problematic. You know, SeaWorld has these very generous conditions. If there's a criticism of animals being in tanks, that's a different argument than what the advocate made here, because this argument is really about the size of the tanks, and the truth is that they are pretty good sized tanks. That's the way I think that needs to be explained. On the employee's argument, it's okay. It's a lot of assertions. I assume that this is SeaWorld's policy. I don't know where you got this information from, if it's their employment policy, if they've got a public relations office that stated those kinds of things. The notion that they promote from their own ranks, well, that would suggest that there are people who've had experience working in the park. That's what you need to be saying. That's what that ultimately has to mean, I think. The notion that they would prefer somebody with a college degree, that's minimum qualifications. I think you and I talked about this a little bit. The truth of the matter is every kid in the world would love to be an animal trainer at SeaWorld, you know, when they're little kids. But obviously not every kid in the world gets there. How do those people get there? They don't get there just because they were randomly chosen and said, oh, well, here's a good summer job, play with the whales. You know, like you said, they have to go through an apprenticeship. They reach different levels of competency that they're doing that. And I think what the argument that you want to make is 4 years working with whales is a hell of a lot more useful than, 3 years in school studying whales and not having any contact with them. And, how are you going to know a whale better than having worked with it? I think that's the way you want to go with that argument. On the mistreatment issue, I think you did a very good job in arguing that the whales are primarily rescue animals. I don't remember if the advocate cited any particular reason why they thought the animals were mistreated except for the collapsed dorsal fin. I do like the fact that you use the advocate's own source to explain what the reason for the collapsed dorsal fin is. I also think you're missing one point, and that is there any demonstration this collapsed dorsal fin is harmful to the animals? I didn't hear anything from the advocate that said it was harmful, and I didn't hear you pointing out that there was an absence of anything about it that was harmful, and that seems to me like a key presupposition on that argument that you need to speak about. All right.